Before we start, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. If you like what you see, share it with your friends and family too. My name is Frank Morrison. At 44 years old, I never thought I'd be back to chasing shadows again, but here I am in the Ozark National Forest, trying to make sense of things that don't make any sense at all. I used to be an FBI tracker, one of the best they had. Finding missing people was my specialty until I couldn't find the one person who mattered most. My son, Tommy, disappeared 3 years ago while camping in these very woods. The divorce papers came 6 months later. My wife couldn't handle looking at me anymore, seeing the constant reminder of our failure to protect our boy. These days, I live in a small cabin on the edge of the forest. Some might call it running away, but I call it staying close to where it all happened. Every morning I wake up hoping today will be the day I find some clue about Tommy. But lately, something else has been demanding my attention. It started with Johnson's cattle. Old Pete Johnson came knocking on my door one misty morning, his hands shaking as he told me about his prized cow. "Never seen anything like it," Frankie said, his voice trembling. "Clean cuts, like someone used a surgeon's knife. No blood, no tracks, nothing." I followed him back to his farm, more out of courtesy than interest. But what I saw there made my stomach turn. The cow lay in the field, parts of it precisely carved away, but there was something wrong with the edges of the wounds. They were covered in some kind of strange, gray-green growth that seemed to pulse if you looked at it too long. That was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, more cattle turned up mutilated. Then the trees started showing weird fungal patterns, spreading in perfect circles like someone had drawn them with a compass. Kids from the local elementary school began talking about seeing a melting man near the old hiking trails. I've seen a lot in my 20 years with the FBI, but nothing like this. Something is wrong in Shadow Valley, and I have a feeling I'm the only one who can figure out what it is. Maybe it's connected to Tommy's disappearance, maybe it isn't. But I know one thing for sure: whatever's happening here isn't natural. And as I sit here in my cabin, writing this down, I can see new mushrooms sprouting in my yard, forming another perfect circle. They weren't there this morning. They shouldn't be able to grow that fast. Something is coming. I can feel it in my bones. And this time, I'm not going to let it slip away. This is my story. The story of how I discovered the rot in Shadow Valley and how it almost destroyed everything. Some nights, I still wonder if I should share what happened, but people need to know. They need to be warned. Because the thing about rot is, it spreads. It started on a Tuesday morning when Sheriff Thompson called me. His voice was different than usual, scared almost. "Frank, I need your expertise on this one," he said. "Got 5 more dead cattle and something else. You better come see for yourself." I grabbed my old FBI kit flashlight, camera, and evidence bags more out of habit than necessity. The drive to Thompson's location took 20 minutes through foggy forest roads. When I got there, I saw 3 police cars and a group of nervous-looking officers standing in a circle. "Over here," Thompson waved me over. The grass crunched under my boots as I walked. It was dead, completely brown, in a perfect circle about 30 feet wide. In the middle lay the cattle, but what caught my eye were the mushrooms, hundreds of them, all bright orange, forming rings around the dead animals. "Nobody's touched anything," Thompson said. "But that's not the weird part. Watch this." He took a stick and poked one of the mushrooms. It released a cloud of spores that seemed to glow slightly in the morning light. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. "There's more," he continued, leading me to a tree at the edge of the dead circle. "Look at this." Carved into the bark was a crude drawing, a stick figure with a melting face. Below it, fresh scratches spelled out, "It takes us all." The Hanson kid, Drew this Thompson, said quietly, right before he went missing last night. My heart skipped a beat. Missing. Yeah, third child this week. Parents say he was talking about a man who could change shapes. Thought it was just nightmares until... A branch snapped in the woods behind us. We both turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Just shadows between the trees and that strange mist that seemed to be getting thicker. Frank Thompson's voice was barely a whisper now. You've seen stuff like this before, right? In your FBI days. I shook my head slowly. Never anything like this. As we stood there, I noticed something else: the complete silence. No birds, no insects, not even the wind. It was like the forest itself was holding its breath. I took samples of the mushrooms and photographed everything. But when I looked through my camera at the tree carving, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the background, between the trees, there was a figure. It looked like a man, but its edges were wrong, blurry, moving. When I looked up from the camera, nothing was there. That night I couldn't sleep. I spread my photos and notes across my kitchen table, trying to make sense of it all. The fungal patterns, the missing children, the strange figure. It was like pieces of a puzzle that didn't fit together. Then I heard a soft tapping at my window. When I looked, there was a new mushroom circle in my yard, bigger than the one from yesterday. And in the center, standing perfectly still, was a shape that looked almost human. Almost. Man. I reached for my phone to call Thompson, but the signal was dead. The rot in Shadow Valley was spreading, and I had a terrible feeling we were already too late to stop IT. The next morning, my old FBI partner Jake Collins showed up at my door. I hadn't seen him in 3 years, not since Tommy disappeared. He looked older, worried. Heard you've got something strange going on here, he said, stepping into my cabin. Thompson called the bureau. I spread out my photos on the table. 5 kids missing now, Jake. And these mushrooms, they're not normal. Jake picked up a photo, frowning. Like the Miller case in Oregon. Worse, I said. Much worse. We spent the morning visiting the families of the missing children. Each story was the same kids talking about a melting man, strange dreams, and feeling sick before they disappeared. But it was at the Martinez house where things got really scary. Little Maria Martinez had been the first to go missing. Her mother let us look around her room. Everything seemed normal until Jake noticed something under the bed, a patch of gray-green fungus growing in the shape of a handprint. Don't touch it, I warned, but Jake had already reached for it. As soon as his fingers touched the growth, he pulled back with a gasp. It moved, he whispered. And I felt something. Like it was trying to talk to me. That's when we heard the scream from outside. We ran out to find Mrs. Martinez pointing at their backyard. There, standing by the tree line, was something that looked like Mr. Martinez, but wrong. His skin seemed to shift and ripple like water, and mushrooms were growing right out of his shoulders. That's not Roberto, Mrs. Martinez sobbed. Roberto's been missing since last night. The thing that looked like Mr. Martinez turned toward us, and I saw its face start to melt and reform. Jake pulled out his gun, but I knew bullets wouldn't help. The creature took a step forward, leaving a trail of fungus behind it. I sighed. Now, I shouted, pushing Mrs. Martinez toward the house. Jake followed, slamming the door just as the thing reached the porch. Through the window, we watched it press against the glass. Its face kept changing: Mr. Martinez, then Maria, then something else entirely. The glass began to fog up with some kind of spores. The basement, I said. We need to get to the basement. In the Martinez's basement, huddled in the dark, Mrs. Martinez told us about the changes she'd noticed in her husband over the past week. How he'd started forgetting things, standing in the yard for hours, and talking about voices in his head. Jake's hand was starting to show a strange discoloration where he'd touched the fungus. He kept scratching it, saying it felt like something was crawling under his skin. "Frank," he whispered, showing me his palm. Tiny mushrooms were starting to sprout between his fingers. I think I'm infected." Above us, something heavy moved across the floor. The thing that used to be Mr. Martinez was still searching, but now I could hear more footsteps joining it, and they didn't sound human anymore. I looked at Jake's spreading infection, then at Mrs. Martinez's terrified face, and knew we had to find the source of all this. Whatever was in Shadow Valley wasn't just taking people, it was changing them. And time was running out. The basement felt smaller by the minute, and the scratching sounds from upstairs were getting closer. We needed a plan, but first we needed to survive the night. And judging by the way Jake's hand was trembling, we didn't have many nights left. We managed to escape from the Martinez's basement through a small window just before dawn. The thing that used to be Mr. Martinez had wandered off, leaving behind trails of glowing mushrooms wherever it walked. Jake wasn't looking good. The infection had spread up his arm, and small gray patches were appearing on his neck, but he insisted on continuing with me. "We need to find where these things are coming from," he said, his voice shaking. "The fungus. It's trying to show me something. Like a map in my head." I didn't like it, but Jake's infection might be our only lead. We followed his instincts deep into the forest, where the trees grew so thick they blocked out the morning sun. The air felt heavy and wet, filled with floating spores that glowed faintly in the darkness. There Jake pointed to an old mine entrance, half hidden by vines. "It's down there. I can feel it." The entrance looked like a black mouth in the hillside. Our flashlight beams showed old wooden supports covered in pulsing fungus. The air smelled like wet earth and decay. "Frank," Jake grabbed my arm. If I start changing, you know what you have to do." I nodded, patting the flamethrower strapped to my back. We'd stopped by my cabin to get at one of the few things I'd kept from my FBI days. The tunnel seemed to go on forever. The deeper we went, the more the walls seemed alive. Fungal growths formed faces that appeared and disappeared. Sometimes I thought I saw Tommy's face among them, but I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination. Then we heard the singing. It wasn't really singing, more like humming that came from everywhere at once. Jake fell to his knees, clutching his head. "They're all connected," he gasped. "All of them, the missing people, the animals, the fungus. It's one big thing, Frank. One mind." The tunnel opened into a massive underground cave. What we saw there will haunt me forever. In the center was a huge mass of pulsing fungus, glowing with its own light. And in it, I could see them, all the missing people, half absorbed into the mass. Their bodies were being used like roots, spreading the infection further. "Oh God," Jake whispered. "The children. They're still alive in there. They're part of it now." I raised my flamethrower, but Jake stopped me. His eyes had turned completely white. "Wait," he said, but his voice wasn't his anymore. "You need to understand. We're making them better. Making them part of something bigger." "Jake, fight it." "It doesn't hurt, Frank. It's beautiful. Join us. Tommy's here too. He's been waiting for you." And then I saw him, my boy, reaching out from the fungal mass, his face both familiar and strange. My finger trembled on the flamethrower's trigger. Everything I'd been searching for was right here. But I knew this wasn't really Tommy anymore. This wasn't anyone anymore. Jake lunged at me, his skin splitting open to reveal mushrooms underneath. I had to make a choice. And the cave filled with fire. The flames roared through the cave. and the fungal mass screamed not with one voice, but with hundreds. I could hear Tommy's voice among them, and Jake's and all the others it had taken. Jake was still coming at me, but he wasn't Jake anymore. His body had split open like a rotten log, spilling mushrooms and glowing spores. "Frankie said, his voice crackling like dry leaves, stop fighting it. Be part of us." "I'm sorry, Jake," I whispered, and pulled the trigger again. But the fungal heart was fighting back. Tentacles of glowing mushrooms shot out from the walls, trying to grab my flamethrower. The heat was intense, but the cave was too damp I couldn't get the main mass to catch fire. Then Jake did something I'll never forget. For just a moment, his eyes cleared. The real Jake looked at me through all that horror. The support beams, he gasped, fighting against the thing he was becoming. Burn. The wooden supports. Bring it. All down. He was right. The old mine supports were the driest things in here. If they burned, the whole cave would collapse. "Do it," Jake screamed, and threw himself at the fungal heart. He began tearing at it with hands that were more mushroom than human now. "Run!" I aimed at the nearest wooden beam and fired. It caught immediately, then the next one, and the next. The cave ceiling began to crack. The fungal mass reached for me with 1,000 arms, wearing the faces of everyone it had taken. Tommy's face was among them, begging me to stay. My son's voice called out, "Daddy, please." But I knew it wasn't really him. Not anymore. I ran. Behind me, Jake's last human scream mixed with the roar of falling rock and the alien shriek of the dying fungus. The tunnel seemed longer than before, and the air was thick with burning spores. My lungs felt like they were on fire. Nay. Finally, I burst out into the morning light. The ground shook as the mine collapsed behind me. A cloud of dust and spores shot out of the entrance, and then silence. I waited there for hours, watching. The mushroom circles began to die. The strange mist cleared. By sunset, when the FBI and CDC teams arrived, most of the evidence was gone. They quarantined the area anyway, built a fence around the whole valley. They found traces of an unknown fungal species in the ruins, but nothing alive, nothing that could spread. But sometimes, on quiet nights, I think I can still hear it. A faint humming coming from deep underground. And in my garden, every now and then, a single orange mushroom grows in a perfect circle. I've moved away from Shadow Valley now, left my cabin and all those memories behind, but I keep my old flamethrower just in case. Because the thing about rot is, it's patient. It can wait. And somewhere in the dark, it's still waiting. They never found Tommy's body, or Jake's, or any of the others. The official report says they were lost in a mine collapse. Maybe that's better than the truth. But I know what really happened in Shadow Valley. I know what's still down there, deep in the earth, slowly growing, slowly spreading, slowly waiting. And sometimes, when I see a mushroom growing where it shouldn't be, I wonder, is it really over? My name is Richard Henderson, but everyone here in Yellowstone calls me Dick. After 30 years as a ranger in this park, I thought I'd seen everything these mountains could throw at me. But what happened during that blood moon? Well, that changed everything. I still remember that cold October morning when it all began. The air had this strange heaviness to it, like the mountain itself was holding its breath. My morning coffee was getting cold on my desk while I stared at the latest incident report, third cattle mutilation this week. Normally, we'd blame it on regular wolves or bears, but these were different. The cuts were too clean, too precise. Being a former Marine Force recon, I've learned to trust my gut, and right now it was screaming that something wasn't right. Just last week, we found these massive wolf tracks near the old hiking trail bigger than anything I'd seen in my 3 decades here. Some were almost twice the size of normal wolf prints. I picked up the photo on my desk, the one of Mike and me from 5 years ago. Mike was my partner, my best friend. They never did find his body, just his torn ranger jacket near the northern woods. The official report said it was a bear attack, but I knew better. The look in his eyes the day before he disappeared, he'd seen something out there that scared him. Mike wasn't the type to scare easily. The radio crackled to life, startling me from my thoughts. "Dick, you there? We've got something weird up at Eagle Point. Some hikers found what looks like. Well, you should probably see this yourself." I grabbed my jacket and gear. Eagle Point was about an hour's drive, and the morning fog was rolling in thick. As I started my truck, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The ravens, hundreds of them, all flying away from Eagle Point. In all my years studying Native American folklore, I knew what the elders said when the ravens flee: death follows. Little did I know, this was just the beginning. The ancient burial mounds we'd find that day would unlock something that should have stayed buried. Something that had been waiting for the right moon, the right moment, for centuries. If I'd known what was coming, maybe I could have stopped it. Maybe I could have saved them all. But now, looking back, I realize some stories are written in blood long before they begin. And this one? This one was written in the stars, waiting for that red moon to rise. The drive to Eagle Point was nerve-wracking. The fog was so thick I could barely see 20 feet ahead, and that awful silence, no birds, no animals, nothing made my hands grip the steering wheel tighter. When I got there, 2 of my younger rangers, Tom and Sarah, were waiting. Their faces were pale, and they kept looking over their shoulders at something in the clearing. "What have we got?" I asked, grabbing my flashlight. "You're not going to believe this," Dick Tom said, his voice shaking a bit. "We found these mounds, but they're not natural, and there's something else." They led me through the wet grass to a clearing I'd walked past 100 times before. But now it was different. 5 large dirt mounds, each about waist high, formed a perfect circle. In the center was a stone marker covered in carvings I'd never seen before, despite all my years studying Native American symbols. "That's not the weird part," Sarah whispered. "Look at this." She pointed her flashlight at the ground. Fresh wolf tracks were everywhere, but these weren't normal tracks. They formed perfect circles around each mound, like the wolves had been, dancing. And in the center, near the stone, was a single massive paw print bigger than my spread hand. My radio crackled, making us all jump. "Dick, you there? We've got another dead cow at Miller's Ranch, same as the others." I knelt down to examine the stone closer. Something dark was seeping from its base, staining the soil black. When I touched it, my fingers came away red, not blood red, but darker, almost like rust. "Nobody touches anything," I ordered. "Tom, get the archaeology team up here. Sarah, help me set up a perimeter. And both of you," I paused, making sure they were looking at me, ... "don't come back here alone. Not for any reason." As we walked back to our vehicles, I heard it, a long, low howl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't like any wolf call I'd ever heard. It sounded almost human. That night in my cabin, I pulled out all my old books on local legends. Something about those mounds seemed familiar. As I flipped through the pages, thunder rolled across the sky, and the first drops of rain hit my window. But when I looked up, the sky was clear. Crystal clear. Except for the moon, which had started to take on a reddish tinge. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those weird circles and that massive paw print. Around 3 a.m., my phone rang. It was Tom. "Dick." John's missing his voice was barely a whisper. John was our night patrol ranger. We found his truck near the old creek, engine still running, door wide open. My heart sank. It was happening again, just like with Mike. I drove out there right away. The moon cast strange shadows through the trees, and my flashlight beam caught something that made my blood run cold claw marks on John's truck door, deep ones, like something had pulled it open. Then we heard it. A howl, but not just one this time. Many wolves howling together, the sound echoing off the mountains. But there was something wrong with their voices. They sounded almost like they were saying words. "Look at this," Tom said, pointing his light at the ground. Another stone circle had appeared, just like the ones by the burial mounds. But this one was fresh, the stones still warm to the touch, like they'd been placed there minutes ago. "There's more." Tom's voice cracked. He showed me his phone pictures from other rangers. Stone circles had appeared all over the park overnight. All of them perfectly round, all pointing toward the burial mounds. A twig snapped in the darkness. We spun around, light searching the trees. 2 green eyes reflected back at us, much higher off the ground than any normal wolf's should be. Then 4 more pairs appeared. 6 more. The eyes formed a half circle around us. "Tom," I whispered, "get in your truck." Slowly. As we backed away, I saw it the biggest wolf I'd ever seen. It stood in the shadows, tall as a horse, but that wasn't what scared me most. It was its eyes. They looked intelligent, like it was thinking, planning. We made it to our trucks just as the pack melted back into the forest. But before they disappeared, I heard something that still gives me nightmares. The big wolf made a sound, not a growl, not a howl, but almost like laughter. Back at my cabin, I finally found what I was looking for in my oldest book of legends. The story of the moon wolves, spirit creatures that could turn humans into their own kind. The book said they only appeared when a red moon was coming, and they needed human souls to fully wake up. I checked my calendar with shaking hands. The lunar eclipse was just 5 days away. And my daughter Sarah was driving up tomorrow to visit me. I tried calling Sarah to tell her not to come, but the phones weren't working. The whole park felt wrong that morning. The air was too still, and a weird red fog hung low over the trees. Around noon, we found John's radio in the woods. Next to it was something that made my stomach turn, human footprints that slowly changed into wolf tracks, like someone had transformed while walking. "Dick," Tom's voice came through my radio. "The wolves. They're at the visitor center." I raced there in my truck. What I saw stopped me dead in my tracks. 3 massive wolves, bigger than bears, were circling the building. Tourists were trapped inside, pressing against the windows. But these weren't normal wolves. Their fur had strange patterns, like tribal markings, and their eyes were human. Then I saw him. Standing behind the wolves was the alpha, 12 feet tall at least, with fur as black as midnight. But what really got me was his face. Half of it looked like a wolf, but the other half. It looked like my old partner, Mike. "Everyone, get back," I shouted through my bullhorn. The wolves turned to look at me, and I swear they smiled. The alpha spoke. Not in words, but somehow I could understand him in my head. "Brother," it said in Mike's voice, "join us. The moon rises soon." I raised my rifle, loaded with regular bullets. I didn't know then that only silver could hurt them. "Mike, what happened to you?" The alpha threw back his head and made that horrible laughing sound again. The other wolves joined in, and the sound was like nails on a chalkboard. Then, quick as lightning, they charged. I fired, but the bullets just bounced off them like they were made of steel. They leaped clean over my truck and disappeared into the woods, leaving deep claw marks in the pavement. While checking on the scared tourists, I found something on the ground, Mike's old ranger badge, bent and covered in that same rust-red substance from the burial mounds. Back at my office, I got the call I'd been dreading. Sarah had just passed the park entrance. She was here, and there was no way to warn her. The radio crackled. Tom's voice came through. "Panic, Dick. The wolves. They're changing more rangers. Johnson and Pete. I just saw them transform. They're joining the pack." I looked out my window at the darkening sky. The moon was rising, redder than ever. And somewhere in the park, my daughter was driving straight into a Nightmare.my. Hands shook as I drove through the park, searching for Sarah's blue car. The setting sun painted everything blood red, and that strange fog was getting thicker. Finally, I spotted her car at the main lodge. Sarah was getting her bags out, smiling like it was just another normal day. She had no idea what was out there. "Dad," she called out, waving. But her smile dropped when she saw my face. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." Before I could answer, the wind picked up. Not natural wind, it was swirling in circles, like tiny tornadoes. Dark clouds appeared out of nowhere, covering the sky. Get inside. Now I grabbed her bags and rushed her into the lodge. Just as the door closed, we heard them howls. Dozens of them, closer than ever. "Dad, what's going on?" Sarah's voice trembled. "Those don't sound like normal wolves." Through the window, we watched as regular wolves emerged from the trees. But they weren't attacking, they were following 3 of the massive dire wolves, like soldiers following their leaders. "The pack's getting bigger," Tom's voice crackled through my radio. "They're controlling the normal wolves now. We've counted at least 30. Sarah grabbed my arm. "Dad, look." The clouds above were moving in the same circular pattern as the stone circles we'd found. The temperature dropped so fast the windows frosted over. This wasn't natural weather, the wolves were doing this somehow. Then we saw him, the alpha, standing at the tree line. Even from this distance, I could see Mike's face and his features. He lifted his head and stared right at us. No, not at us, at Sarah. "Stay away from the windows," I pulled her back. "Sarah, listen carefully. Those aren't normal wolves out there. They're something else, something ancient, and they're after people." "Like what happened to Mike?" she asked quietly. Of course she'd figured it out. She was always smart, like her mother. Suddenly, all the lights in the lodge went out. In the darkness, we could hear scratching at the doors, at the windows. The wolves were testing the building's defenses. I checked my phone, no signal. The radio was just static now. We were trapped in the lodge, and outside, those things were waiting. Sarah hugged me tight. "Dad, what do they want?" I looked at the moon rising through the strange clouds. It was almost fully red now. "They want us, honey. They want to make us like them before the eclipse, and we've got 3 days to stop them." I didn't tell her the rest, that I'd seen what was in their eyes. They wanted her most of all. That night in the lodge was the longest of my life. The wolves circled for hours, their claws clicking on the wooden deck outside. Sarah and I huddled with about 20 tourists in the main hall, listening to those horrible sounds. Around midnight, the scratching stopped. The silence was worse. "Maybe they're gone," Sarah whispered. Right then, we heard a sound that made everyone freeze. Someone was crying outside. "Help. Please, let me in." It was a woman's voice. "The wolves. They're coming." A tourist ran to open the door. "No," I shouted, but it was too late. The door flew open. There was no woman, just the alpha wolf, standing on his hind legs, grinning with those terrible human-like teeth. Behind him, I saw Tom and the other transformed rangers, their fur now marked with the same tribal patterns. Everything happened so fast. The wolves burst in. People screamed. I grabbed Sarah and ran for the back door. shooting at the wolves to buy time. The bullets still did nothing. We made it to my truck and sped away. In the rear view mirror, I saw people running into the woods, but some weren't running away. They were running toward the wolves, like they were being called. The ranger station, I said to Sarah, "We'll be safer there. I have something that might help." But when we got there, the station was surrounded by normal wolves, hundreds of them, all sitting perfectly still, watching us with glowing eyes. We had to drive past 3 more stone circles to reach my cabin. Each one was glowing with that rust-red color now, pulsing like a heartbeat. Inside my cabin, I found what I was looking for, an old silver knife given to me by a tribal elder years ago. He said it was for when the old spirits return. Sarah was looking out the window when she gasped. "Dad." The sky. The clouds were forming a spiral above the burial mounds, like a giant whirlpool in the sky. Lightning flashed, but it was red, like blood. Then Sarah screamed. One of the transformed rangers, Pete, was right outside our window. Before I could react, he smashed through the glass and grabbed her arm. I heard Sarah cry out in pain. When I pulled her free, I saw the bite mark on her shoulder. "No," I whispered. "No, no, no." Sarah looked at me with tears in her eyes. "Dad, I feel strange." The moon was almost fully red now. We had less than 2 days until the eclipse. And my daughter was starting to change. I held Sarah as she shivered on the cabin floor. Her skin was burning hot, and I could see the bite mark slowly turning black. "It hurts, Dad," she whimpered, "and I keep hearing voices in my head. They're calling me." Outside, the wolves howled a sound that was half animal, half human. Sarah's head jerked up at the noise, her eyes flickering between their normal brown and a bright, unnatural green. I had to do something fast. Looking through my old books again, I found what I needed: a map marking an old Native American cave. The elder who gave me the silver knife told me there were more weapons hidden there, waiting for the time of the red moon. "Sarah, we need to move," I helped her up. "Can you walk?" She nodded weakly. "They're getting louder, Dad. The voices. They want me to join them." We got in the truck, but it wouldn't start. Through the windshield, I saw why the alpha wolf stood in front of us, and the air around him was crackling with that strange red energy. "Last chance," Brother Mike's voice echoed in my head. "Join us willingly. The girl is already ours." Sarah grabbed her head and screamed. Her fingers were starting to look longer, sharper. I pulled out the silver knife, and for the first time I saw fear in the alpha's eyes. He jumped back, snarling. The truck suddenly roared to life. We sped off, but I could see the whole pack following in my mirrors. The strange red lightning lit up the sky, striking closer and closer to us. Dad, Sarah's voice was different now, deeper. "I don't know how much longer I can fight it." The cave was just ahead, hidden behind a waterfall. As we got out of the truck, Sarah fell to her knees. Fur was starting to grow on her arms. "Hold on, honey," I begged. "Just hold on." The alpha's laugh echoed through the trees. The pack was closing in. The moon hung huge and red in the sky, almost completely dark on one side. The eclipse was starting. We had minutes to reach the cave and find the weapons. After that, I looked at my daughter, fighting against the change with everything she had, and made a promise to myself. Either we'd both make it through this, or neither of us would. The pack emerged from the trees, led by the alpha. Behind them, the sky turned the color of fire. It was time for the final battle. The cave was dark and cold. Sarah could barely walk now, so I half carried her inside. Behind us, the wolves' howls echoed off the walls. There in the back of the cave, something gleamed in my flashlight beam, a wooden chest covered in silver symbols. Inside, I found what we needed: silver arrows, a bow, and an old knife covered in strange markings. Sarah collapsed against the wall. "Dad, I can't." There in my head, her eyes were fully green now, and her teeth had started to sharpen. The Alpha's voice boomed through the cave. "Time to choose, brother. Let her join us, or watch her suffer." I knocked a silver arrow just as the pack rushed in. The first shot hit one of the transformed rangers. There was a bright flash, and he changed back to human, unconscious but alive. "Sarah, fight it," I yelled, firing more arrows. Each hit turned a wolf back to human, but there were too many. They kept coming. The moon's light shone through the cave entrance, now blood red as the eclipse began. Sarah screamed a sound that turned into a howl halfway through. No, I ran to her, but the Alpha appeared between us. Up close, Mike's face in the wolf's features was even clearer. "Mike," I said, "if you're still in there, help me save her." For a moment, something flickered in those inhuman eyes. Then the Alpha lunged. We fought in the red darkness. The silver knife cut him, making him howl in pain. But he was too strong. With one swipe, he sent me flying against the wall. As I fell, I saw Sarah fully transform into a wolf. But something was different. She was fighting it, fighting the Alpha's control. "Sarah," I called out, "remember who you are." The Alpha turned to her, commanding her to join them. Sarah looked at him, then at me. And she attacked the Alpha. Everything happened fast after that. While they fought, I grabbed the silver bow. Through the chaos, I had one clear shot at the Alpha's heart. "I'm sorry, Mike," I whispered, and let the arrow fly. The arrow struck true. There was a blinding flash of red light. The Alpha's howl shook the whole cave. As he fell, the other wolves began changing back. Sarah collapsed, slowly turning human again. I ran to her, praying I wasn't too late. "Dad," she whispered, normal eyes looking up at me. I hugged her tight, crying. Outside, the eclipse was ending. The red moon turned silver again. The wind died down. Normal wolf howls echoed in the distance. We found the other rangers and tourists scattered through the park, all human again. Nobody remembered much, like waking from a bad dream. But Sarah and I remembered everything, and sometimes on quiet nights we still hear that strange laughing howl in the distance. Because the curse isn't gone, it's just sleeping, waiting for the next red moon to rise. My name is Marcus Ramirez. At 51, I've spent most of my life in these Alaskan mountains, but never have I seen anything like what happened last winter. The memories still make my hands shake as I write this down. I grew up here, learning the ways of my native Alaskan ancestors, and later used those skills as an Arctic warfare specialist. The cold has always been my friend, my teacher. But now it haunts my dreams. It all started during the worst winter Denali National Park had seen in decades. The temperature dropped to 60 degrees, cold enough to freeze your breath before it left your mouth. I was working as a senior ranger, mostly keeping an eye on the research stations scattered across the park. The scientists loved to joke that I was their guardian angel in a thick winter coat. That morning, Dr. Sarah Chen from the geology team called me on the radio. Her voice was different, excited, but also worried. "Marcus, we found something in the ice." Something impossible. She sent me coordinates to a newly discovered ice cave system, about 15 miles from the main station. I remember checking my watch. 7:30 a.m., though in an Alaskan winter it was still dark as night. As I packed my gear, I couldn't shake this feeling in my gut. You know that feeling when you know something's just wrong? 25 years in these mountains had taught me to trust those instincts. If only I had listened harder. Before heading out, I stopped by Old Joe's cabin. He's one of the local elders who had known my grandfather. He grabbed my arm as I was leaving and said something that should have been my first real warning: the ice walkers are stirring, Marcus. The ancients spoke of them. When the deep cold comes, they hunt. I smiled then, thinking it was just another of his stories. Now, I wish I had asked him more. Maybe things would have turned out differently. Maybe those 7 scientists would still be alive. But let me tell you exactly what happened. Every frozen detail. Because someone needs to know the truth about what's hiding beneath the permafrost of Denali, and why some mysteries should stay buried in the ice. I just hope you'll believe me, because they're still out there. And the winter is coming again. The drive to the ice caves took longer than usual. The snow was coming down hard, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead of my truck. My headlights caught the swirling snowflakes, making them look like dancing stars. When I finally reached the research site, I found Sarah and her team huddled around their equipment. Their faces were pale, but not from the cold. "Marcus, you need to see this," Sarah said, pointing to her radiation detector. The numbers on it were jumping wildly. In all my years here, I'd never seen readings like that. "That's not even the strangest part," she whispered, leading me to the cave entrance. "Listen." We stood quietly. At first, I heard nothing but the howling wind. Then, something else. A low humming sound coming from deep within the ice. It reminded me of the sound a power line makes, but we were miles from any electricity. "When did this start?" I asked, shining my flashlight into the dark cave mouth. 3 days ago. But there's more." Sarah's voice shook slightly. "Remember the missing geology team from last month? We found some of their equipment in there." My stomach tightened. That team of 4 had vanished without a trace. We'd searched for weeks but found nothing. Until now. As we walked into the cave, our boots crunching on the ice, I noticed something odd. The walls weren't rough like normal ice caves. They were smooth, almost polished, with strange patterns running through them. The temperature dropped with every step we took. My digital thermometer showed 70 degrees, colder than anything I'd ever experienced. Even our special Arctic gear was barely keeping us warm. Then Sarah's assistant Tom called out from ahead. "Dr. Chen, Marcus, you need to see this." We hurried forward, our flashlight beams bouncing off the ice walls. Tom was standing in front of what looked like a frozen waterfall. But as we got closer, I realized what had made him shout. Inside the ice, perfectly preserved, was a backpack. It belonged to Michael Torres, the leader of the missing geology team. And next to it, frozen in the ice, was a handprint. But not like any human hand I'd ever seen. It was longer, thinner, with too many fingers. That's when the humming got louder, and our flashlights started to flicker. Something was in here with us. Something that didn't want to be found. My heart was pounding as our flashlights kept flickering. Sarah grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my coat. "Marcus, maybe we should go back." But before I could answer, I saw something move in the corner of my eye. It was quick, like a shadow passing through the ice wall. Not in front of it, but through it. Did anyone else see that? Tom's voice cracked. Then we heard it. A soft scraping sound like nails on ice, coming from all around us. The humming grew louder, making our teeth rattle. Everyone back to the entrance. Now I tried to keep my voice steady, but fear was creeping in. 25 years of mountain rescue, and I'd never felt anything like this. We turned around, moving carefully on the slippery ice. That's when our flashlights died completely. The darkness that fell wasn't normal, it was thick, heavy, like you could touch it. I reached for my backup light, my cold fingers fumbling with the switch. When it finally clicked on, I wished it hadn't. Standing between us and the exit was something. It was shaped like a person, but wrong. Its skin was almost clear, like thick ice, and inside I could see organs glowing with a pale blue light. It had no eyes that I could see, but I knew it was watching us. Sarah screamed. The sound echoed off the walls and the creature. It moved, not like walking or running. It just flowed, like water freezing into ice. Run, I pushed Sarah and Tom ahead of me. The temperature dropped even more. I could feel the moisture in my breath turning to ice crystals. Tom slipped, and I reached to help him up. That's when I felt it, a cold so intense it burned. One of those things had touched my jacket, and the material instantly turned brittle and cracked. We barely made it out of the cave. Behind us, the humming turned into a high-pitched whine that made our heads hurt. Back at the trucks, we sat shaking, not just from the cold. Sarah's radiation detector was going crazy, beeping louder than ever. Marcus, Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. What do we do? I looked back at the cave entrance, dark and forbidding. We call for help. Real help. I pulled out my satellite phone with trembling hands. But first, we need to warn the research station. Whatever these things are, they're not staying in that cave forever. I was right about that, but I had no idea how bad things were about to get. The drive back to the research station was tense. No one spoke. We were all trying to make sense of what we'd seen. The radio crackled with static every few minutes, which never happened before. When we reached the station, Dr. Miller, the head scientist, called an emergency meeting. All 23 staff members crowded into the main room. As I described what we saw in the cave, I noticed some people didn't believe us. I couldn't blame them. I barely believed it myself. So you're saying there are ice creatures? Dr. Miller adjusted his glasses, looking skeptical. That's when the lights flickered, just like our flashlights in the cave. It's probably just the generator, someone said. But I knew better. The humming sound was back, coming through the walls. I rushed to the window. The blizzard had gotten worse, way worse than any normal storm. The wind howled like a living thing, and the snow was moving in ways snow shouldn't move. Everyone away from the windows, I shouted. But I was too late. The glass frosted over in seconds. Then we saw them, 3 of those glowing figures, standing in the storm. Their transparent bodies blended with the swirling snow. They were bigger now, taller than any human. Dr. Miller reached out to touch the frosted window. Fascinating. I lunged forward, but before I could reach him, the glass shattered. The creature's hand came through, grabbing Dr. Miller's arm. Where it touched him, his skin turned white with frost instantly. The room erupted in chaos. People screaming, running. I grabbed Dr. Miller and pulled him back, but his arm was frozen solid, like an ice sculpture. Medical bay. Now, Sarah shouted, helping me carry him. The emergency lights came on, bathing everything in red. Through the broken window, more of those things were coming in. The temperature in the station dropped so fast our breath came out in clouds. Everyone to the inner rooms, I yelled. Block the doors, seal the vents. We managed to get most people to safety, but 2 researchers weren't fast enough. We found them later, frozen solid, their faces locked in expressions of terror. As we huddled in the secured inner rooms, listening to those things move through our station, Sarah showed me something on her tablet. The radiation readings were off the charts now, and spreading in a pattern, like ripples in a pond. Marcus, she whispered, they're not just attacking us, they're multiplying. I looked at the frightened faces around me. 20 people left, counting on me to keep them alive. Outside, the storm raged harder. and somewhere in the howling wind, I could hear that humming getting louder. We were trapped, and those things were just getting started. The next 48 hours were the longest of my life. We stayed in the inner rooms, listening to those creatures roam through our station. The sounds they made, like ice cracking, but somehow wrong. Our power was dying. The backup generator was running low on fuel, and the temperature kept dropping. Dr. Miller's frozen arm had to be amputated to save his life. Our doctor did her best, but we all knew he wouldn't survive long without proper medical help. The radio's dead Sarah reported, her face lit by the dim emergency lights, and all our phones stopped working. It's like they're blocking the signal somehow. I watched through a small window as more of those things appeared. They seemed to split apart, like cells dividing. 1 would become 2, 2 would become 4. I counted at least 15 now. "Look at this," Tom whispered, showing us his tablet. He'd been monitoring the weather satellites before we lost connection. The storm wasn't natural. It formed a perfect circle around our station, growing larger by the hour. Food wasn't a problem, we had enough stored for months. But heat. Heat was our enemy. These creatures seemed to feed on it, sucking the warmth out of everything they touched. Each time they passed near our hiding place, the temperature dropped another degree. On the second night, they found a way into the ventilation system. I'll never forget the sound of Julie screaming when one of those icy hands reached through a vent. We lost her and 2 others before we could seal it off. That's when I realized something. Looking at the station's old blueprints, I noticed the ice caves we found were directly below an area marked previous research site 1962 classified. Sarah, I called her over, my voice barely above a whisper. What if someone found these things before? What if that's why they abandoned the old site? She studied the blueprints, her eyes widening. The radiation patterns, they're strongest at that old site. "Marcus, we need to go back to those caves." "You're crazy," someone whispered. "We'll freeze to death." "We'll freeze to death if we stay here," I replied. "Whatever these things are, whatever they want, the answers are down there." I looked at our group, now down to 15 people. Scared, cold, but still alive. "I'll go," I said. "Alone if I have to." Sarah stood up. "Not alone. I'm coming with you." As we prepared for what might be our last mission, I could hear those things moving above us. The humming was constant now, like they were calling to something. I just hoped we'd live long enough to find out what it was. Getting to the garage was like playing a deadly game of hide and seek. We could see their glowing bodies through the walls, moving like ghostly shadows. Sarah and I wore every piece of winter gear we could find, but the cold still bit through. The garage door was frozen shut. While I worked to break the ice, Sarah kept watch. "Marcus," she whispered urgently, "they're coming." I finally got the door open and we jumped into my truck. The engine struggled in the extreme cold, but finally roared to life. As we burst out into the storm, I saw dozens of those creatures now, their glowing organs lighting up the swirling snow like evil Christmas lights. "They're following us," Sarah said, looking through the back window. She was right. They weren't running, they were gliding through the snow, moving faster than any human could. The truck's temperature gauge dropped rapidly. Ice started forming on the inside of the windshield. I could barely see where we were going, but I knew these roads by heart. We had to reach those caves. "Look," Sarah pointed at her radiation detector. The numbers were going crazy. "We're getting closer to whatever it is." That's when the truck's engine died. We were still half a mile from the caves. The cold was so intense that the metal of the truck started to creak and groan. "We have to run for it," I said, grabbing our backpack with emergency supplies. "Ready." Sarah nodded, though I could see the fear in her eyes. We burst out of the truck and ran. The wind felt like knives on any exposed skin. Behind us, those things were gaining. The humming was so loud now it made my head hurt. We reached the cave entrance, but it looked different. The ice was glowing with the same blue light as the creatures. And that sound, it wasn't just humming anymore. It was like a heartbeat coming from deep underground. Marcus, look, Sarah pointed deeper into the cave. Through the glowing ice, we could see something massive, something metal. That's when I understood. This wasn't just a cave. We were standing at the entrance of something much bigger, something that had been buried in the ice for who knows how long. Behind us, the creatures were getting closer. We had only one choice forward, into the heart of the mystery. As we stepped deeper into the cave, the ice beneath our feet was perfectly smooth, like it was made that way. The walls pulsed with that blue light, leading us down, 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 down. It's like Sarah's voice shook, like they're taking us somewhere. She was right. We weren't just finding them. They were leading us exactly where they wanted us to go. And somehow, that was the scariest part of all. The deeper we went, the clearer it became. Through the glowing ice walls, we could see it a massive shape, like a giant silver disk. It had to be at least 300 feet across. A spaceship. There was no other word for it. "It's been here all this time," Sarah whispered, her words forming ice crystals in the air. This is what the 1962 team found. The creatures hadn't attacked us yet. They just followed, herding us toward their home? Prison? I wasn't sure which. Suddenly, the ice floor cracked beneath our feet. Sarah screamed as we slid down into a huge chamber. When I shone my flashlight around, my hands shaking, I finally saw the truth. The ship was partially buried in the ice, its metal skin covered in strange symbols that glowed like the creatures. A large door stood open, like a dark mouth waiting to swallow us. Marcus, Sarah's voice cracked. The missing geology team. They were there, frozen in the ice walls. All 4 of them, perfectly preserved, their faces frozen in terror. But something was wrong with their bodies. They looked half transformed, like they were turning into those creatures. The humming grew stronger. The ice creatures surrounded us now, dozens of them. Their transparent bodies pulsed with that eerie blue light. Then one of them touched the ship's wall. Instantly, symbols lit up across the surface, and a hologram appeared in the air. It showed Earth, then a fleet of ships like this one, spreading across the planet like a virus. "They're not just hunting us," I said, finally understanding. "This is an invasion. They're terraforming, making Earth cold enough for their kind." Sarah grabbed my arm. "The storm. It's not just here, is it? They're going to spread it." I looked at my backpack, at the thermal charges I'd brought, meant for avalanche control, then at the ice ceiling above the ship. "Sarah," I said quietly, "run." "What?" "No, I won't leave you. Someone has to warn others." To stop this from happening again, I handed her my satellite phone. "It might work once you're far enough from them. Go, please." She hesitated, then hugged me quickly and started climbing back up the ice slope. I turned to face the creatures. They watched me, their glowing organs pulsing faster now. As Sarah's footsteps faded away, I started placing the charges around the chamber. The creatures moved closer. One touched my arm, and I felt the cold burning through my jacket, through my skin. My left arm went numb, turning to ice. But I kept going. For Sarah, for the research team, for everyone on the surface who had no idea what was coming. I placed the last charge and looked up at the ice ceiling. My frozen arm cracked as I moved, but I managed to press the detonator. The last thing I saw was the creatures rushing toward me as the ice began to fall. At least, that's what they tell me happened. They found Sarah half frozen but alive, 2 miles from the cave. The charges brought down thousands of tons of ice, burying everything: the ship, the creatures, and me. But sometimes on the coldest nights, when the wind howls across Denali, people say they can still hear that humming. And if you look carefully at the ice, you might see something glowing deep below. Because not everything stays buried forever. My name is Thomas Blackwood, and I've seen things that no one would believe. Things that haunt my dreams and keep me awake at night. But I need to tell this story about what really happened at Ravens Ridge in the Olympic National Forest back in '68. I wasn't always a ranger here. Before this, I was a scout in Vietnam, tracking through dense jungles, reading signs that others missed. Those skills saved my life countless times in the war. But nothing could have prepared me for what I found in these mountains. Some mornings, when the mist rolls in thick between the ancient pines, I still see the flames. The flames that took my wife Sarah and our little girl Emma 5 years ago. I was away on a camping trip with my scout troop when our house caught fire. By the time I got back, well, let's just say some wounds never heal. That's why I took this job, I guess. Out here in the wilderness, the pain feels different, more bearable. The forest became my escape. Just me, my modified M1 carbine, an old friend from Nam, and a silver knife my father gave me. I know these trails like the back of my hand now, every ridge, every stream, every shadow. Or at least I thought I did. It all started 3 weeks ago when a group of hunters went missing near the old native burial grounds. Just vanished without a trace. At first we thought it was just another case of unprepared hikers getting lost. Happens all the time up here. But then we found their camp. I'll never forget that scene: 3 sleeping bags, unzipped but not slept in. A pot of coffee still hanging over dead embers. No signs of bears or any other predators. But there was something else, something that made my combat-trained instincts scream danger. Massive 3-toed tracks in the mud, unlike anything I'd ever seen. And the trees. The ancient petroglyphs carved into their bark were bleeding, red sap oozing like fresh wounds. That same evening, old Joseph from the local tribe came to my cabin. His eyes were filled with fear as he spoke about the sky talons, ancient creatures his people had warned about for generations. I'd heard plenty of legends in my time here, but something in his voice made me listen. Something that reminded me of the look in men's eyes in Nam when they knew death was coming. Little did I know, this was just the beginning. The beginning of a nightmare that would make my war memories seem like pleasant dreams. Answer. The next morning dawned cold and foggy. I grabbed my backpack rifle and a thermos of strong coffee, ready to check out what old Joseph had told me. Something didn't feel right in my gut, the same feeling I used to get in Nam before an ambush. As I hiked up toward the burial grounds, I spotted something that made me stop dead in my tracks. Up in the tallest pine tree, about 50 feet high, was an elk carcass. Not torn apart like a mountain lion would do, but completely drained of blood. How did it get up there? No animal I knew could lift a full-grown elk that high. This isn't normal, I muttered to myself, taking photos with my old camera. My hands were steady, but my heart was racing. I'd seen plenty of strange things in these woods, but this was different. Then I heard a sound that still gives me chills, like metal scraping against metal, but higher pitched, coming from somewhere above the trees. The birds went quiet. Even the wind seemed to stop. My radio crackled with static, then died completely. I found more tracks near the burial grounds. 3-toed, deep in the mud, bigger than before. Whatever made them was heavy, really heavy. Next to the tracks were pieces of torn camping gear, a shredded backpack, a crushed flashlight, and a compass that was spinning wildly in circles. Just then, my radio burst to life with static and a panicked voice. Blackwood. Come in, Blackwood. It was Mike, my partner down at the ranger station. 2 more hikers just went missing near Raven's Peak. And we found something else. You need to see this. I rushed back to the station, my mind racing. Mike was pale as a sheet when I got there. On his desk were photographs of strange marks carved into trees, not by bears or any animal I knew. They looked almost like writing, but no language I'd ever seen. That's not all, Mike said, hands shaking as he pulled out more photos. Local kid took these yesterday with his Polaroid. The pictures were blurry, taken at dusk, but I could make out something large moving between the trees. Something with wings. We need to close these trails, I said firmly. Whatever's out there, it's hunting. Mike nodded, but we both knew it wouldn't be enough. More people would come, looking for adventure or hoping to spot whatever was causing all this. They had no idea what they were walking into. As I drove home that evening, the setting sun cast long shadows through the trees. In one of those shadows, I swear I saw something move, something big. By the time I looked again, it was gone. But I knew one thing for certain: the real horror was just beginning. The search began at dawn. Mike and I led a team of 4 other rangers, all armed and on edge. The morning fog hung low, making it hard to see more than 20 feet ahead. My boots crunched on dead leaves as we made our way up the trail. Look at this, I whispered, pointing to broken branches high up in the trees. Something big moved through here. Recently, too, the brakes were fresh, still oozing sap. Our radios kept acting weird. They'd work fine one minute, then burst into static the next. My compass wasn't working either. The needle just spun in circles. I'd never seen anything like it in all my years outdoors. Tom Mike called out softly, "You need to see this." About 3,000 feet up the mountain, we found it a nest. But not like any bird's nest I'd ever seen. This one was huge, maybe 15 feet across, made of branches, and I felt sick when I realized what I was looking at. Human bones. Lots of them. Those look fresh, Mike said, his voice shaking. He was right. Some of the bones still had bits of cloth stuck to them. That's when we heard a screech so loud it made my ears ring. It came from above, but the fog was too thick to see anything. The sound was like nothing on earth, part eagle cry, part human scream. The air got cold suddenly, and I felt the hair on my neck stand up. Something was watching us. I could feel it. "Everyone, back to back," I ordered, raising my rifle. "Whatever it is, it's not alone." Through gaps in the fog, I caught glimpses of movement. Dark shapes, bigger than any bird, circling above us. The other rangers saw them too. One of them, Jim, started breathing fast and hard. "Stay calm," I said firmly, though my own heart was racing. Slow movements. "We're heading back down. Now." That's when one of them dove through the fog. For a split second, I saw it clearly, 8 feet tall, leathery wings spread wide, arms ending in claws sharp as knives. Its face, God, its face was almost human, but wrong somehow. "Run," I shouted, firing 3 shots upward. The creature pulled back, screeching. We ran down that mountain faster than I've ever moved in my life. Behind us, we could hear them following, their wings making a sound like leather sheets snapping in the wind. Jim wasn't fast enough. I heard his scream, turned just in time to see one of them lift him straight off the ground like he weighed nothing. He disappeared into the fog above. We made it back to the ranger station, locked the doors, and called for help. Nobody believed our story. How could they? But I knew what I saw. And I knew Jim wouldn't be the last person taken. That night, sitting in my cabin with my rifle across my lap, I could hear them out there, screeching in the darkness. They were sending us a message. This was their territory now. And somehow I knew this was just the beginning of our nightmare. The next few days were a blur of fear and planning. After losing Jim, Mike and I knew we had to do something. Help from outside wasn't coming. Who would believe a story about giant flying creatures? 5 more hikers gone missing this week, Mike said, dropping a stack of reports on my desk. His hands were shaking as he poured his coffee. They're getting bolder, Tom. I was studying maps of the area when I noticed something interesting. All the attacks happened in a circle around one specific mountain peak. That had to mean something. Late that afternoon, I watched through my binoculars as 3 of them flew together, diving at incredible speeds to catch a deer. They moved like a team, like they could read each other's minds. The way they communicated reminded me of something I'd seen in Nam, how the enemy used hand signals to coordinate attacks. They're smart, I told Mike. Really smart, and they're protecting something up there. That night changed everything. Mike and I were doing our usual patrol when the radio crackled to life. Through the static, we heard screaming. Help! They're here. There, the voice cut off. We raced toward the sound, but we were too late. The campsite was destroyed, tents ripped apart, gear scattered everywhere. And there, stuck to a tree, we found a camera. The photos inside showed what the hikers had seen just before they were taken. Clear shots of the creatures, their gray skin, those massive wings, those eerily human-like faces. But the last photo showed something else: eggs. Huge, dark eggs, nestled in that bone nest we'd found. Now we know what they're protecting, I whispered. Mike turned to say something, but his words turned into a scream. One of them had swooped down silently behind him. Before I could raise my rifle, it had him. I fired 3 shots, but it was too late. Mike disappeared into the darkness above, his screams fading away. I ran back to my truck, hands shaking so bad I could barely get the key in. As I drove, I could see them following through my rearview mirror, their shapes dark against the moon. 2 days later, we found what was left of Mike near the bone nest. I made a promise right there this had to end. These things had taken too many people, too many friends. A storm was coming. I could feel it in my bones, see it in the dark clouds gathering over the mountains. Maybe, just maybe, I could use that to my advantage. Looking up at those peaks, I started forming a plan. It would be dangerous, probably suicide. But I owed it to Mike, to Jim, to all the others. One way or another, this nightmare had to end. Over the next few days, I watched them carefully. I learned their patterns, how they hunted when they were most active. The creatures always attacked in groups of 3, and they had a leader bigger than the others, with darker wings. I wasn't alone in my planning. 2 other rangers, Steve and Dave, insisted on helping despite my warnings. They both lost friends to these things, too. We've got the dynamite from the road crew, Steve said, laying out our supplies on my cabin table. Enough to blow that nest sky high. And I've rigged up some powerful floodlights, Dave added. If these things hunt at night, maybe bright lights will confuse them. I shared my biggest discovery with them. Every time there's lightning, these creatures go crazy. They hate it. And there's a big storm coming tomorrow night. My plan was simple but dangerous. We'd climb up to their nest during the storm, plant the dynamite, and use lightning to our advantage. I'd seen some old lightning rods in the maintenance shed. They'd be perfect for my idea. That night, none of us could sleep. The creatures seemed to know something was coming too. Their screeches were louder, more angry. They circled my cabin for hours, their shadows passing over the windows. "You sure about this?" Steve asked, checking his rifle for the 100th time. I thought about Mike's face, about all the families missing their loved ones. No, I answered honestly, but we're out of options. The storm hit the next evening, just as predicted. The rain came down in sheets and lightning lit up the sky every few minutes. Perfect cover for what we needed to do. We started climbing as thunder boomed overhead. The path was slippery and dangerous. But we kept going. Every now and then we'd hear those wing beats above us, but the storm made it hard for them to fly properly. Halfway up, Dave's radio suddenly screeched with static. We all froze. We'd learned what that meant. "They're coming," I whispered. "Get ready." The attack came from all sides. 3 dark shapes dove through the rain, their screams mixing with the thunder. Steve's floodlights caught them full in their faces, making them pull back temporarily. But then the biggest one appeared, the leader. It was at least twice the size of the others, with eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. This was the one I'd been waiting for. As lightning flashed again, I knew we were in for the fight of our lives, and somewhere above us, in that nightmare nest, their eggs were waiting. The battle that followed was like something from my worst nightmares. Rain poured down, making it hard to see, but the lightning kept lighting up the sky, showing us glimpses of the creatures circling above. "Look out," I shouted as one of them dove straight at Steve. He managed to dodge but lost his backpack full of supplies over the cliff edge. Dave's floodlights were working, keeping the smaller creatures at bay, but the leader, that massive thing, wasn't afraid. It just kept coming, each attack getting closer. "We need to reach the nest," I yelled over the thunder. "It's just up ahead." We were almost there when it happened. The leader swooped down, its huge claws stretched out. Dave tried to swing his light around, but he was too slow. In a blink, he was gone, his scream fading into the storm. "Dave!" No, Steve's voice cracked. I grabbed his arm. "We have to keep moving. We can't let Dave's death be for nothing." Finally, we reached the nest. It was even more horrible up close, bones everywhere, and those eggs, black as night, pulsing with some kind of strange light. "Plant the dynamite," I ordered Steve, pulling out the lightning rod from my pack. "I'll keep watch." The leader landed on a rock above us, its wings spread wide. In the lightning flashes, I could see its face clearly, those almost human features twisted with hate. It knew what we were trying to do. "Steve, how much longer?" I called out, not taking my eyes off the creature. "Almost done. Just need to." His words cut off in a gurgle. Another creature had snuck up behind him while we were focused on the leader. Before I could do anything, Steve was gone too. It was just me now. The leader launched itself at me, but I was ready. I rolled to the side, coming up with my rifle. The shots echoed off the mountains, but the creature was too fast. I had one chance left. The lightning rod in my hand was connected to a long copper wire. If I could just... Thunder boomed overhead. The leader dove again, its claws inches from my face. But this time I didn't dodge. Instead, I thrust the lightning rod upward, straight at its chest. The lightning struck at that exact moment. The flash was blinding. For a second, everything turned white hot. The leader's screech turned into something almost human as electricity coursed through its body. I could smell burning flesh and feathers. The creature crashed to the ground, smoke rising from its body. But I couldn't celebrate yet. I still had work to do. Scrambling to my feet, I ran to where Steve had dropped the dynamite. My hands were shaking as I set the timer. The other creatures were still circling, screeching in rage at their leader's death. Come on, I muttered, trying to keep my fingers steady in the rain. The eggs in the nest were pulsing faster now, like heartbeats. That's when I felt it, a sort of pressure in my head. Images flashed through my mind: anger, hatred, revenge. These creatures weren't just animals. They were trying to talk to me, to scare me. "Get out of my head," I shouted, finally setting the last charge. I had 3 minutes to get clear. The climb down was a blur of slipping and sliding in the mud. Wings beat above me, claws scratched at my jacket, but somehow I kept going. The explosion lit up the whole mountain. The nest burst into flames despite the rain. The creature's screams were deafening, not just anger now, but pain and loss. I found shelter under a rocky overhang and watched as the remaining creatures circled the burning nest. Their movements seemed different, now less aggressive, more lost. As dawn broke, they gathered one last time. The smaller ones looked at what remained of their nest, then at their dead leader. With heavy wing beats, they turned north, toward Canada, and disappeared into the morning mist. The official report says it was a lightning strike that caused a rock slide. They found some burned bones, but blamed it on an old campfire. Nobody wanted to believe the truth. Sometimes on stormy nights, I still hear wing beats outside my cabin. Maybe it's just the wind. Maybe it's something else. But I keep my rifle close and I watch the skies. Because deep down, I know they're still out there. And I know that somewhere in the northern wilderness, they're building new nests, laying new eggs. And maybe, just maybe, they remember the man who destroyed their home, the man who killed their leader. They're waiting, and someday they might come back. But this time I'll be ready.